Welcome back, or if this is your first time here, welcome to the kind of stories that keep you awake at night. This is a confession from inside one of Vault-Tec's greatest experiments. The story of an overseer who knew the truth from day one, who spent 17 years executing protocols designed to break human beings, who made choices no one should ever have to make, who became a monster, one decision at a time. You think you know about the vaults. You've heard about the experiments, the cruelty, the suffering, but you haven't heard it from the inside, from the person who had to pull the triggers, who had to choose who suffered and how much, who had to smile while conducting atrocities. This is that story, and I promise you, it's worse than you think. Because the most horrifying experiments weren't the ones with obvious victims. They were the ones where good people were turned into executioners, where love was weaponized, where family became collateral damage. This is what it really means to be a Vault-Tec Overseer who knows the truth. And by the end, you'll understand why that knowledge is a curse worse than any experiment. And if you genuinely enjoy this kind of dark storytelling, consider subscribing and liking the channel, but only if you like the content. They told me I was chosen, special, qualified, the kind of person who could handle responsibility, handle pressure, handle the weight of keeping hundreds of people alive in a sealed underground box while the world burned above us. I believed them. God help me, I believed every word they said. That was 15 years ago. 15 years since I signed the contract in that sterile white room with fluorescent lights that made everyone look like corpses. 15 years since they looked me in the eye and told me the truth about what the vaults really were. I remember that day with the kind of clarity that comes from trauma. You know how some memories fade, get softer around the edges, until you're not sure what really happened? This one never fades. Every detail is sharp as broken glass. The way Dr. Braun's assistant checked the door 3 times before they started talking, the sound of the lock clicking, the weight of the folder they slid across the table, unmarked, gray, heavy enough that it made a sound when it hit the metal surface. They didn't ease into it. No preamble, no comfort. Just the truth, delivered like a diagnosis you can't survive. The vaults aren't shelters, they're laboratories. Every single one, except for 17 control vaults scattered across the country, was designed to experiment on its residents, not to save them, to use them, to push them to breaking points and document what happens when you do. My vault, the one I'd be overseeing, the one my family was already registered for, had its own special purpose. I won't tell you which vault I was assigned to. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I'll tell you this much. My experiment wasn't designed to fail quickly. It was designed to be sustainable, generational. The kind of horror that would unfold slowly, giving Vault-Tec decades of data to analyze, the kind that would break people in stages so they could chart the progression. I asked why they needed an overseer who knew the truth. Couldn't they just program it all into the vault computer? Let it run automatically? Dr. Braun's assistant smiled when I asked that. It wasn't a warm smile. Human oversight is essential, she said. The experiment requires judgment calls. Adaptation, someone who can maintain the parameters while appearing to care about the residents. Someone who can be both protector and executioner. Someone who can lie convincingly every single day. She was describing a monster. I didn't understand that she was describing me. Not then. It took time to realize I'd already agreed to become that monster the moment I walked into that room. I was 31 years old. My wife was 29. We had a daughter, 5 years old, with her, mother's eyes, and my stubborn chin. A son on the way. We lived in a modest house 20 minutes from the vault entrance. Normal people. Good people. I worked in civil engineering. My wife taught elementary school. We paid our taxes. We went to neighborhood barbecues. We were exactly the kind of wholesome American family that Vault-Tec loved to put in their advertisements. That's why they chose me. Not in spite of my normalcy, but because of it. They wanted someone with something to lose, someone who could be controlled. They gave me a choice. That's what they called it, anyway. A choice. Refuse the position and walk away, They'd select another overseer. My family would still be admitted to the vault, they said, but I wouldn't be in control. I wouldn't be able to protect them. I wouldn't know what was coming. Somebody else would be making the decisions that could save them or kill them. Somebody who might be crueler, less careful, more willing to sacrifice individuals for the greater experiment. Or I could accept, take the position, learn the truth, gain the power to make choices, even within the constraints of the experiment. Maybe find ways to minimize the harm. Maybe keep my family safe. Maybe be the shield between them and Vault-Tec's worst impulses. It wasn't a choice. It was a trap disguised as a choice. But I took it anyway. I told myself I was being pragmatic, strategic, that by accepting, I was doing the right thing, protecting my family from the inside, being the lesser evil. The truth? I was afraid, terrified of what would happen if I said no, terrified of losing control, terrified that someone worse would hurt the people I loved. So I signed. I initialed every page. I accepted the title of Overseer. I swore an oath to maintain the experiment parameters as defined by Vault-Tec. I agreed to submit weekly reports. I agreed never to disclose the truth to the residents. I agreed that deviation from protocol would be grounds for termination, not just termination of employment. They were very clear about that. Terminate the overseer, terminate the family, keep everyone in line. They gave me 6 months to prepare. 6 months of secret training sessions in facilities I can't name, in rooms that don't appear on any floor plan. They taught me how to lie, how to maintain composure under stress, how to make hard decisions quickly, how to rationalize actions that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. They showed me case studies from other vaults, some that succeeded by their metrics, some that failed. They wanted me to understand the stakes. They wanted me to see what happened when an overseer broke protocol or tried to sabotage the experiment. Vault 19's overseers both ended up dead when their paranoia experiment spiraled out of control. Vault 92's overseer was killed by his own residents when the subliminal messaging drove them violently insane. Vault 11's first overseer was sacrificed by his own people the moment he told them about the yearly requirement. These weren't cautionary tales. They were threats. Step out of line, and this is your fate. So I learned. I absorbed. I practiced the smile I'd need to wear every single day, the reassuring voice I'd use during announcements, the compassionate expression I'd maintain during crisis meetings. I became two people, the public overseer, beloved leader of the vault, and the private overseer, Vault-Tec's obedient servant. The bombs fell on the 23rd of October 2077. I was at the vault entrance, greeting residents as they arrived, families pouring in, terrified, grateful, clutching children, and bags and pets. The air raid sirens wailing, the horizon glowing orange, people crying, thanking me for saving them, for getting the vault door open in time. I smiled. I patted shoulders. I assured them everything would be fine. We were safe here, protected. The vault would keep us alive. I didn't tell them what I already knew, that the real danger wasn't outside. It was in, here with us. It was me. The door sealed at 1447 hours, 2,000 pounds of steel and lead, sliding shut with a sound like thunder. Final, absolute. Everyone inside cheered, hugged each other, sobbed with relief. They'd made it. They were survivors. My wife found me in the crowd, our daughter on her hip, tears streaming down her face. She kissed me, told me she was so proud, so grateful I'd gotten us spots in the vault. Our children would live. We'd beaten the apocalypse together. I held them both and felt like I was already dead inside. The first week was chaos, people adjusting to the space, the systems, the new reality, figuring out sleeping arrangements, getting to know neighbors, exploring the common areas, children crying for pets they'd left behind, homes they'd never see again, adults trying to process the fact that everyone they knew on the surface was probably dead. I was busy, constantly moving, answering questions, mediating disputes, establishing routines. I have time to think about what came next. I was grateful for the distraction, because I knew what was coming. I had the sealed orders in my private terminal, the ones only I could access, the ones that outlined exactly when and how the experiment would begin. Some experiments started immediately. The moment the door sealed, residents were exposed to whatever variable Vault-Tec had designed: radiation leaks, drug-laced air, social manipulation. But mine had a delay built in. 6 months, just long enough for people to settle in, to feel safe, to start believing this might actually work. Then the parameters would activate and everything would change. I had 6 months to live as a normal person, to pretend I was just the overseer, to almost forget what I was really doing here. It was the cruelest kindness Vault-Tec ever gave me. That brief window of normalcy before I had to start destroying the people I was supposed to protect. During those 6 months, I got to know them, not as subjects, as people. Robert Chen, the engineer who'd worked on the vault's construction and couldn't stop pointing out little design flaws. Maria Castellanos, the nurse who set up our medical bay with ruthless efficiency. James Peterson, former military, who organized a security rotation before I even asked. Catherine Walsh, the teacher who started classes for the kids within a week. Normal people, decent people, trying to build something good in the ruins of everything they'd lost. They trusted me, looked to me for guidance, for hope. I gave them both, knowing what I was about to do to them. What do you think really happened here? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd like to know if I'm the only one who feels this way. My family settled in too. Our son was born in month 3, Daniel, healthy, perfect. My wife recovered well. My daughter started school in Catherine's classroom. We had quarters in the residential sector, nothing special, same size as everyone else. I'd insisted on that. Some vaults gave the overseer luxury accommodations, private spaces, extra rations. I couldn't stomach it, not when I knew what was coming. So we lived like everyone else. Ate in the cafeteria, used the communal showers, stood in line for supply requisitions. It made me more popular with the residents. They appreciated that their overseer wasn't above them. Little did they know it was guilt, not humility. The 5th month arrived. Then the 6th. I started sleeping less, having dreams where I told everyone the truth, and they tore me apart with their bare hands. Started making excuses to avoid family dinners, spending more time in my office, staring at the sealed terminal, dreading the day it would unlock. My wife noticed, asked if I was okay, if the stress was getting to me. I lied, told her I was fine, just working hard to keep everyone safe. She believed me. Everyone believed me. That was the problem. I'd gotten too good at lying. The night before month 6 ended, I didn't sleep at all. Just sat in my office, watching the countdown timer on my terminal, knowing that in a few hours, everything would change. The experiment would begin, and I would have to execute it. The parameters appeared on my screen at 01 on the first day of month 7. Detailed instructions, schedules, protocols, everything I needed to begin slowly destroying these people's lives while maintaining the illusion that I was helping them. I read it 3 times. Then I opened my desk drawer and stared at the pistol I'd hidden there months ago, wondering if I had the courage to end this before it started. I didn't. I closed the drawer, downloaded the instructions to my personal data pad, and started planning how to implement phase 1 of Vault-Tec's grand experiment. By breakfast time, I was back to being the smiling overseer. Cheerful announcements over the PA system, friendly waves in the hallway, reassuring conversations at the cafeteria table. Nobody suspected, nobody knew. That's what Vault-Tec had trained me for, to be the perfect liar, to care deeply about people while simultaneously planning their destruction, to be human and monster at the same time. And I was good at it. God help me, I was so good at it. The first directive was simple: adjust the food ration distribution system to create artificial scarcity, not enough to starve anyone, just enough to make them worry, to create tension, to see how quickly cooperation would erode when resources became limited. I implemented it in week 2 of month 7, changed the requisition protocols, reduced weekly allocations by 15%, blamed it on calibration errors in the storage systems, promised we were working on a fix. People grumbled but accepted it. They trusted their overseer. By week 4, fights were breaking out in the ration line. Robert Chen punched David Martinez over the last protein pack. 2 families stopped speaking because one had been hoarding extra portions. Catherine Walsh found students stealing food from the cafeteria. I documented all of it, typed detailed reports into my secure terminal, noted how quickly social bonds fractured under pressure, sent it to Vault-Tec's mainframe, knowing no one would ever read it because Vault-Tec was probably ash by now. But the experiment required documentation, so I documented. Like a scientist observing rats in a maze, I restored normal rations in month 8, apologized for the delay in fixing the systems. Everyone forgave me immediately. They were so relieved to have proper food again that they didn't question why the fix took so long. They threw a celebration dinner, invited me to speak. I gave a speech about community resilience, about how proud I was of how everyone had pulled together during the shortage, how we'd proven we could survive anything as long as we had each other. They applauded. Some people cried. My wife squeezed my hand and whispered that she loved me. I went home that night and vomited until there was nothing left. Then I pulled up phase 2 on my terminal and started planning the next manipulation. This was my life now. Create crisis, observe breakdown, document results, restore normalcy, repeat. Each cycle carefully designed to push them a little further, to see how much they could take before something permanent broke. The experiment wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, it was erosion. Slow, methodical erosion of trust, stability, and hope. Phase 2 introduced random electrical failures in different sectors. Lights flickering off for hours at a time, doors malfunctioning, environmental controls failing. Never enough to endanger life support, but enough to make people anxious, uncertain, unable to predict when the next failure would occur. The randomness was the point. Vault-Tec wanted to know how unpredictability affected psychological stability. I was the one who triggered each failure, sitting in my office with my override controls, watching camera feeds, choosing which sector to plunge into darkness next. I chose residential sector C on a night when I knew families with young children were sleeping there. Watched the panic on the monitors as parents scrambled to calm terrified kids, listened to the emergency calls flooding security, waited exactly 43 minutes before restoring power, long enough for fear to set in, not long enough for anyone to get hurt, documented the psychological impact, noted 3 cases of new childhood anxiety, 1 parent requesting sedatives from medical, 2 families requesting sector transfers, textbook responses to environmental instability. I was becoming fluent in the language of controlled trauma. James Peterson, head of security, came to my office after the 3rd incident. He was suspicious. Too many malfunctions in too short a time. Systems that had worked perfectly for months, suddenly failing. He thought sabotage. Someone deliberately causing problems. He wanted to investigate, run security checks, maybe start monitoring certain residents who'd been vocal about vault policies. I thanked him for his vigilance, told him I'd personally oversee a systems diagnostic, promised to get to the bottom of it. Then I filed a report, noting that the security chief was becoming problematic, might need to be neutralized before he discovered the truth. Neutralized. That's the word Vault-Tec used in the training manuals. Not killed, not silenced, neutralized, as if we were talking about a chemical spill instead of a human being. The manual outlined several strategies: reassignment to duties that kept them away from sensitive areas, subtle social manipulation to undermine their credibility, controlled substance administration through medical channels if necessary, or, in extreme cases, staged accidents. I never thought I'd seriously consider murdering someone to protect an experiment, but here I was, reading through the protocols, thinking about which option would raise the least suspicion. I chose option 1, gave James a promotion, made him director of external security monitoring, a position that sounded important but was meaningless since there was nothing outside to monitor. Gave him an office on the other side of the vault, lots of busy work, fake reports to file about perimeter conditions. He was grateful, proud, told me he wouldn't let me down. I smiled and shook his hand and felt like I was drowning in sewage. That's what this job was. Drowning in sewage while everyone around you thought you were swimming in clean water. My wife started noticing the changes in me, the distance, the sleepless nights, the way I'd zone out during dinner, staring at nothing. She asked if I was having an affair. I almost laughed. An affair would have been simpler, cleaner, a betrayal I could name. Instead, I was betraying everyone, all the time, in ways I couldn't explain. I told her I was fine, just stressed about vault management. She suggested I delegate more, trust the department. Heads, take some time for our family. Reasonable advice that I couldn't follow because I was the only one who could execute the experiment parameters. The experiments escalated. Month 14 brought social engineering protocols. I had to manipulate relationships, spread strategic rumors through trusted intermediaries, create artificial conflicts between cooperative groups, fragment the social structure to test resilience. I became intimate with everyone's secrets. Who was sleeping with who had addiction problems, who had anger issues, who had debts, who had said, what about whom? The Vault's social network was mapped on my terminal like a tactical battlefield. I identified pressure points, exploited them, watched relationships implode. Marcus Webb and Jennifer Hartley had been best friends since childhood, survived the nuclear war together. Their families were close. They supported each other through everything. I needed to fracture that bond, test how external manipulation could destroy organic relationships. So I started a rumor, planted false evidence that Jennifer's husband had made advances toward Marcus's wife, let it percolate through the social network, watched it spread, watched confusion turn to suspicion, turn to anger. The couples stopped speaking. The families divided the vault between them. Friends chose sides. 2 solid friendships destroyed because I needed data points about social cohesion breakdown. Jennifer came to my office crying. She didn't understand what had happened. Everything had been fine, and then suddenly, it all fell apart. She asked if I could mediate, help them reconcile. I told her I'd try. Then I filed a report noting the successful disruption and outlined strategies for preventing reconciliation. I suggested additional rumors to deepen the division, make it permanent, irreversible. I was good at this. That was the worst part. I had a talent for destruction. Month 19 introduced chemical protocols. The manual called them atmospheric adjustment studies. I called them what they were: drugging the air supply, nothing severe. Mild sedatives in Sector A, mild stimulants in Sector B, control group in Sector C. Monitor behavioral changes, document mood alterations. See how pharmaceutical manipulation could control population dynamics. I implemented it on a Tuesday, watched it take effect by Friday. Sector A, residents became lethargic, less motivated, productivity dropped. Sector B, residents became irritable, anxious, conflict increased. Sector C stayed normal. The data was clear. Chemical control was effective. Maria Castellanos noticed something was wrong. She was a good nurse, too good. She started tracking symptoms, noticed patterns. Residents in certain sectors exhibiting similar issues. She ran tests, found trace compounds in the air filters, compounds that shouldn't be there. She came to my office with her findings, asked if I knew what was happening, if we had a contamination problem. I looked at her research, her careful documentation, her genuine concern. Then I thanked her for her diligence, told her I'd investigate immediately, asked her not to alarm anyone until I had answers. Then I went to my terminal and removed her access to advanced medical equipment, reassigned her to general care duties, buried her findings in fake paperwork about routine maintenance contamination, discredited her concerns by having other medical staff verify that everything was normal, made her look paranoid, isolated her professionally. 6 months later, she requested reassignment to sanitation duties. She couldn't handle being a nurse anymore, couldn't trust her own judgment. I'd broken her, systematically, carefully, efficiently. If you've ever wondered what choice you would make in a situation like this, Tell me in the comments. I'll be reading them. I started drinking. There was alcohol in the vault. Not much, but enough. Homemade stuff, distilled by residents who'd figured out how to ferment stored fruits. I drank alone in my office after my family slept. Not enough to impair me during the day, just enough to numb the constant screaming in my head, the screaming that sounded like everyone I was hurting, the screaming that never stopped. I documented my substance use in my personal logs. Vault-Tec would have been proud. Even my self-destruction was data. Year 3 brought the worst directive yet. Introduce scarcity of critical medical supplies. Let people get sick. Let them stay sick. Monitor how the population responded to inadequate healthcare. Document who received treatment and why. Create a hierarchy of medical access. Test how quickly compassion would erode when saving one person meant letting another suffer. I stared at that directive for a week, trying to find a loophole, a way to minimize harm. But the parameters were clear. Specific drugs had to be restricted. Specific rationing protocols had to be implemented. Specific denial criteria had to be enforced. Tommy Rodriguez was 8 years old. He developed an infection. Simple, treatable. We had the antibiotics. But according to the experimental protocols, his age bracket was designated for delayed treatment. I had to make him wait, watch him get sicker, let his parents beg for medicine, deny them, tell them we were running low and had to prioritize critical cases, watch their desperation turn to anger, turn to despair. Tommy survived, eventually. After 2 weeks of fever and pain that could have been stopped in 2 days, his parents never looked at me the same way again. They understood what I'd done, chosen some arbitrary priority over their son's suffering. They were right, but Tommy was lucky. Sarah Brennan wasn't. She was 67, developed pneumonia, needed medication that I'd restricted per experimental protocols. Elderly patients were classified as lower priority, maximum suffering documentation before intervention. I watched her condition deteriorate. Watched her family's frantic appeals get denied by the medical review board I'd secretly instructed to follow protocol. Watched her die. It took 11 days. 11 days of drowning in her own lungs while her family held her hand and begged me to help. I attended her funeral, gave a speech about her contributions to the vault, about how we'd done everything possible, how sometimes medicine just wasn't enough. Her husband killed himself 3 weeks later, hung himself in his quarters. The suicide note said he couldn't live knowing his wife had suffered needlessly, that he'd failed to save her. He didn't know the truth, that I'd killed her, as surely as if I'd smothered her with a pillow. But at least he died not knowing. That was a mercy I couldn't afford. I knew exactly what I'd done, and I'd have to keep doing it, over and over, because the experiment required it. I started having conversations with my reflection, late at night, drunk, asking the man in the mirror who he was, what he'd become. If there was anything human left inside. The reflection never answered, just stared back with dead eyes, the same dead eyes I saw in Vault-Tec promotional materials, the same dead eyes every overseer probably developed eventually. This was the price of knowledge, of power, of choosing to be the executioner instead of the victim. I'd made that choice 3 years ago. Now I was living with the consequences. Year 4 introduced population control measures, not through violence, through manipulation. Contraceptive compounds in the water supply for specific demographic groups, targeted fertility reduction, monitor birth rate changes, document social response to declining population growth, test whether residents would notice, whether they'd care, whether they'd demand intervention. I implemented it, watched pregnancy rates plummet, watched couples struggle to conceive, watched the confusion, the fear, the medical consultations that revealed nothing wrong, because there wasn't anything wrong with them. There was something wrong with me. My wife became one of the affected. We'd talked about having another child. She wanted a daughter to match our son. We tried for 6 months. Nothing happened. She went to medical, got tested. Everything normal. She cried, thought something was wrong with her, with us. I held her, comforted her, lied, told her it would happen when the time was right. knowing I'd made sure it wouldn't happen. I'd sterilized my own wife, added her demographic to the targeted group because the parameters required it. I'd chosen the experiment over my family. Again, Daniel was 4 years old now. My daughter was 9. They were growing up in this cage, this laboratory. They thought it was normal, thought everyone lived in underground vaults, thought the world outside was poisoned forever. They had no idea they were test subjects, that their father was the one running the tests. I watched them play in the common area, laughing, innocent, unaware. I wondered what they'd think of me if they knew the truth, if they'd understand why I did it. I didn't understand anymore. The justifications I'd used in the beginning felt hollow now. I wasn't protecting them. I was destroying everyone around them. That's not protection. That's just slower murder. Year 5 brought the breaking point I'd been dreading. The parameters required me to execute a resident, not directly, through staged accident, plausible deniability. But the manual was clear. One subject needed to be terminated to test population response to sudden, unexplained death, test grief patterns, test stability, test whether anyone would suspect foul play. I had 48 hours to select a target and implement termination protocols, 48 hours to become an actual murderer instead of just a bureaucrat of suffering. I couldn't do it. I sat in my office, staring at the population roster, trying to choose who deserved to die, who I could justify killing. But nobody deserved it. They were all just people, trapped people, desperate people, victims, including me, especially me. I drafted a report explaining I couldn't comply with this parameter, that I was refusing orders, that Vault-Tec could terminate my position but I wouldn't kill anyone. I wrote it, revised it, perfected it. Then I deleted it, because I knew what would happen if I refused. They'd warned me in training. Deviation from protocol meant termination of Overseer and immediate family, my wife, my children. They'd all die because I grew a conscience too late. So I chose Gregory Patterson, single, no close friends, maintenance worker, quiet, kept to himself. The person whose death would cause minimal social disruption, maximum experimental value with minimum collateral damage. I triggered a malfunction in the reactor sector, rigged a coolant valve to fail when he performed his routine inspection, made it look like equipment failure. He died instantly, radiation exposure, quick, relatively painless. I told myself that made it better. It didn't. The vault mourned. Brief memorial service, moment of silence, then life continued. That's what I documented. Population resilience in face of unexpected death, minimal long-term disruption, acceptance of tragedy as random misfortune, successful termination protocol implementation. I typed it all into my terminal. Clinical, detached, professional. Then I went to the bathroom and vomited blood, stress ulcers, physical manifestation of what I'd become. I didn't see a doctor, didn't want to explain the symptoms, just started taking antacids and learned to live with the pain. Physical pain was easier than emotional pain. At least I understood where it came from. Year 6 was when I stopped recognizing myself completely. The man who'd walked into that briefing room 6 years ago was dead, murdered by inches, replaced by something else. Something that could watch children cry and document their tears for scientific value. Something that could optimize human suffering like you'd optimize a supply chain. I looked in the mirror one morning and saw a stranger, hollow, efficient, empty, a perfect Vault-Tec creation. The parameters became more complex. Layered experiments, multiple variables running simultaneously. I was juggling 3 different social manipulation protocols, 2 chemical trials, 1 infrastructure stress test, and ongoing documentation of long-term psychological degradation. My terminal was full of spreadsheets, charts tracking depression rates, graphs measuring social cohesion breakdown, tables calculating optimal suffering to stability ratios. I'd become an accountant of agony, death by spreadsheet. Robert Chen had a breakdown in year 6. The stress finally cracked him. He'd been holding together through the food shortages, the power failures, the medical crisis that killed his friend Sarah. But something small finally broke him. A coffee mug. He dropped his coffee mug in the cafeteria, and it shattered. And he just stood there, staring at the pieces, and started screaming. Not words, just raw animal sound. Security had to restrain him. Medical had to sedate him. He spent 2 weeks in isolation. When he came back, he was different, quieter, more fragile. I documented it all, noted the breaking point, the trigger, the recovery pattern, added it to the file. Catherine Walsh stopped teaching, just walked out of her classroom one day and never came back. The children were waiting for her. She never showed up. They found her in her quarters, sitting on her bed, staring at the wall, not catatonic, just done. She'd given everything she had to those kids, tried to give them normalcy, education, hope, and something inside her finally said, enough. She took a maintenance job instead. Cleaning, repairing, work that didn't require emotional investment, work where you couldn't fail children. I didn't try to convince her to return. I just reassigned her and noted another. Successful subject degradation. My daughter asked me why Mrs. Walsh didn't teach anymore, why so many people seemed sad all the time, why grown-ups cried when they thought no one was watching. She was 9 years old, and she'd already noticed that something was wrong with our world. I told her that everyone was just adjusting, that living in a vault was hard sometimes, that things would get better. She looked at me with those big eyes, my wife's eyes, and I saw doubt there. Children know when you're lying. They might not know what the lie is, but they know. She nodded, said okay, went back to her homework. But she knew. On some level, she knew her father was lying about everything. Year 7 introduced deliberate contamination protocols, small amounts of toxins in specific sectors. Nothing fatal, just enough to cause chronic illness, headaches, nausea, fatigue, unexplained symptoms that medical couldn't diagnose. Residents in Sector D started complaining, feeling sick. No clear cause. I blamed stress, environmental adjustment issues, psychosomatic responses, prescribed placebos, documented the progression, watched people develop real physical illness from psychological torture combined with actual chemical exposure, the perfect storm of human suffering. James Peterson figured it out. Not all of it, but enough. He'd been monitoring systems from his external security post, started noticing patterns I thought I'd hidden, failures that coincided too perfectly with social disruption, chemical readings that didn't match baseline. He came to my office one night, late, when the halls were empty. He didn't accuse me directly, just laid out his findings, asked me to explain the discrepancies, said he was worried someone was sabotaging the vault, maybe a spy, maybe someone who'd gone insane. He was giving me an out, a way to blame someone else, to start a witch hunt, to sacrifice a scapegoat. I looked at James, good man, loyal, dedicated, trying to protect everyone, and I made a choice. I told him he was right. Someone was sabotaging us, and I knew who. I pointed him toward Marcus Webb, the man whose friendship I destroyed years ago, the man who'd become isolated, bitter, easy to blame. I gave James falsified evidence, planted records showing Marcus accessing systems he'd never touched, creating failures he'd never caused. I manufactured a perfect suspect, and James believed me because he trusted me, because everyone trusted me. They arrested Marcus that night. He fought, screamed that he was innocent, that someone was framing him, that the overseer had to investigate. But the evidence was overwhelming. I'd made sure of it. They put him in detention, held a tribunal. I sat as judge, reviewed the fabricated evidence, listened to his desperate defense, found him guilty, sentenced him to permanent isolation in the detention block. Life sentence for crimes he didn't commit, crimes I'd committed and blamed on him. He spat at me when they took him away, called me a traitor, a liar. He was right on both counts. The vault celebrated. The saboteur had been caught. We were safe now. Things would get better. James received commendations. I gave a speech praising his detective work, his dedication to vault security. He shook my hand, thanked me for believing in him. I smiled, congratulated him, then went to my office and added another entry to my list of unforgivable sins. Marcus Webb's life, destroyed completely, to protect my secret, to keep the experiment running. I was past the point of redemption now, had been for years, but this felt different. This was pure self-preservation, not even following protocols anymore, just protecting myself. My son turned 6. We had a party in the common area, cake made from stored ingredients, children playing games, parents pretending everything was normal. Daniel was happy, laughing, surrounded by friends. I watched him and felt nothing. That scared me more than the guilt had. The guilt was fading, being replaced by numbness, by acceptance, by the cold calculation that this was just what life was now. I was losing my capacity to feel, becoming the machine Vault-Tec had wanted. The perfect overseer, inhuman, efficient, untroubled by conscience. Year 8 brought reproductive experiments, not just contraceptive anymore, active manipulation. The parameters required me to implement a selective breeding program disguised as genetic counseling, medical recommendations based on falsified health data, encouraging specific pairings, discouraging others, playing God with people's reproductive choices, creating the next generation according to Vault-Tec's specifications. I implemented it through the medical department, gave them protocols they thought were based on genetic health. They never suspected it was social engineering. Jennifer Hartley got pregnant. Her relationship with her husband had survived despite my earlier manipulation. They were one of the pairings the experiment classified as undesirable, low genetic value, medical complications predicted. I had to terminate it, not directly, through medical channels. Her doctor expressed concerns about genetic markers, recommended abortion, provided falsified test results showing severe fetal abnormalities. She cried for days, made the choice she thought was medically necessary, never knew the tests were fake, never knew her baby was probably healthy. I took that from her. The possibility of motherhood, based on manufactured data, for an experiment that had already failed. The vault population was declining, deaths outnumbering births, people aging, getting sick, giving up. We'd started with 437 residents. We were down to 371, 66 people dead in 8 years, some from natural causes, some from the experiments, some from my direct actions. I maintained detailed records, cause of death, age, duration of suffering, contributing factors. I'd become a historian of atrocity, documenting everything, making sure future generations would know exactly what happened here, except there might not be future generations. We might all die in this hole. Taking the truth with us, Maria Castellanos killed herself in year 9. She'd never recovered from losing her position. From doubting herself, she left a note apologizing for being weak, for not being strong enough to handle vault life, blaming herself for her own destruction. She had no idea I'd systematically broken her, deliberately, carefully, according to protocol. Her funeral was small. Not many people left who remembered her as the competent nurse she'd been. They only remembered the paranoid woman who'd fallen apart. I gave a brief eulogy, then filed a report documenting successful long-term psychological degradation culminating in suicide. The experiment was working. My wife asked for a divorce in year 9. She couldn't live with me anymore. Said I'd become a stranger, cold, distant. She didn't know who I was. She wanted our children to see what a normal relationship looked like, and ours wasn't normal anymore. I didn't fight it, just agreed. We separated. She took quarters in Sector B. I stayed in Sector C. The children split time between us. Daniel asked why Mommy and Daddy didn't love each other anymore. I told him sometimes people grow apart. He was 7 years old and learning that even parents couldn't keep promises. Even love wasn't permanent. Even family could break. I was alone now, really alone. No wife, no family waiting at home. Just me and my terminal and my bottles and my guilt. I worked longer hours, slept less, ate irregularly, stopped caring about my appearance, grew a beard, let my hair get long, stopped changing my vault suit regularly. People noticed, expressed concern, asked if I was okay. I told them I was fine. just working hard, carrying the burden of leadership. They believed me, or pretended to. Either way, they left me, alone, which was what I wanted. Isolation, distance, separation from the people I was destroying. Year 10 brought the directive I'd been dreading. The parameters required me to select my own family for experimental protocols, no exemptions. The experiment required data from all demographics, including overseer-adjacent populations. My children were subjects now. Officially, I could no longer protect them, could no longer keep them in the safe zone. They had to be included, exposed, measured, documented. I read that directive and laughed. Actually laughed. The sound echoed in my empty office. Manic, broken. The sound of a man who'd finally reached the bottom. I enrolled my daughter in a psychological stress study. Nothing severe, just increased academic pressure, monitored anxiety development, tracked coping mechanisms. She started having trouble sleeping, developed nervous habits, bit her nails, pulled her hair. I documented it all. My own daughter's suffering, cataloged, analyzed, reported. She came to me one night crying, said she couldn't handle the pressure, the tests, the expectations, asked why everything felt so hard. I held her, told her she was strong, that she could handle anything, that Daddy believed in her. Then I went to my terminal and adjusted the parameters to increase her stress level because the experiment required it. My son was enrolled in a social isolation protocol, subtle manipulation to reduce his friend group, test resilience in increasingly isolated subjects. I watched him become lonely, confused why other kids didn't want to play anymore, why birthday party invitations stopped coming, why he ate lunch alone. He asked me if something was wrong with him, if people didn't like him. I told him he was perfect, that friends come and go, that he'd make new ones. Knowing I'd programmed the isolation made him a pariah, stolen his childhood, for data, for Vault-Tec, for the experiment that would outlive us all. If this story has kept you listening this far, and you want more of these dark confessions from the wasteland, hit that subscribe button. It tells me someone out there is still paying attention to warnings like these. Year 11 was when the experiment parameters introduced something new, something I hadn't trained for, something that broke the last piece of humanity I had left. The directive was simple. Choose one resident for enhanced suffering protocols, maximum psychological and physical stress. Push them to absolute breaking point, document the entire process, and the subject had to be someone close to me, someone whose suffering would hurt me personally, to test if the overseer could maintain objectivity while inflicting trauma on loved ones. It was the final exam, the ultimate loyalty test. I had 3 options: my ex-wife, my daughter, my son. The directive gave me 48 hours to decide, to choose which person I loved most would be destroyed most completely. I spent those 48 hours, drunk, staring at their names on my screen. 3 people who'd never asked to be part of this, who'd trusted me to protect them, who still believed, despite everything, that their overseer would keep them safe. I was supposed to choose which one to betray most completely, which one to sacrifice on Vault-Tec's altar of science. I chose my ex-wife, not because I loved her less, because I couldn't do it to the children, couldn't deliberately torture my own kids, even after everything I'd already done. Some line I couldn't cross, some boundary that still existed in the wasteland of my conscience. So I chose her, the woman who'd loved me, who'd given me children, who'd tried to save our marriage until she couldn't anymore. I chose her because she was the least innocent, because she was an adult who'd made choices, because I needed some rationalization that would let me sleep at night. It was all bullshit. I chose her because I was a coward. The enhanced suffering protocol was comprehensive, targeted chemical exposure, inducing anxiety and paranoia, social manipulation, isolating her from support networks, falsified medical diagnoses, creating hypochondriac behaviors, systematic destruction of everything that gave her life meaning. I implemented it all, watched her unravel, watched her become afraid of everything, paranoid, convinced she was dying, isolated, desperate. She came to me begging for help. said something was wrong with her, with the vault, with everything, asked if I could investigate, if I could fix it, if I could save her. I told her I'd try. Then I increased the chemical dosages and added new parameters to accelerate her breakdown. She attempted suicide in month 6 of the protocol, cut her wrists in the shower. Medical found her in time, saved her, patched her up, put her on watch. I visited her in medical, held her hand, told her I was glad she survived, that the vault needed her, that her children needed her. She looked at me with empty eyes and said she wished she'd succeeded. I filed a report documenting successful psychological destruction and suicidal ideation development. Then I went to my office and sat in the dark for 3 hours, not drinking, not working, just sitting, existing, being the monster I'd become. Year 12 was the year I stopped pretending there was any point to this. The experiment had long since lost any scientific value. Vault-Tec was gone. The world above had moved on. The data I collected went nowhere. No one was reading my reports. No one was analyzing my findings. I was torturing people for an audience that no longer existed, for a corporation that was dust, for a purpose that had died with the bombs. But I kept going because I didn't know how to stop. Because stopping meant admitting that everything I'd done was meaningless, that I'd destroyed hundreds of lives for absolutely nothing. The vault was dying. 312 residents left, most of them broken in one way or another. Depression was endemic. Suicide attempts were monthly occurrences. Violence was increasing. People fought over nothing, over everything. The social fabric had completely disintegrated. They existed in proximity, but not in community. Everyone isolated, everyone damaged, everyone surviving but not living. I'd done that. 12 years of systematic destruction. This was my legacy. A vault full of walking ghosts. My daughter was 14 now. Anxiety disorder, depression, self-harm behaviors, all documented in her medical file, all caused by protocols I'd implemented. She cut herself, small cuts on her arms that she thought no one could see. I saw them, documented them, added them to the data. She was my daughter, and I turned her into a test subject, exhibiting predictable trauma responses. She barely spoke to me anymore, avoided me when possible, gave one-word answers when I asked questions. She knew on some level, maybe not the details, but she knew her father had failed her, that the overseer had failed everyone. My son was 10, socially isolated, difficulty forming attachments, trust issues. He spent most of his time alone in our quarters, reading old books, playing with broken toys. He'd learned that people hurt you, that friendship was temporary, that even family wasn't safe. He was a decade old and already hardened against the world, already building walls that would follow him forever. I'd stolen his childhood, given him trauma instead, made him into someone who'd never fully trust anyone. The experiment was supposed to study resilience. Instead, it proved that children break when you break them hard enough. Revolutionary science. My ex-wife was in medical full-time now, permanent psychiatric care. She'd had 3 more suicide attempts, developed agoraphobia, couldn't leave her room without panic attacks. The medical staff didn't understand what was wrong with her, why she'd deteriorated so rapidly, why treatment wasn't working. I understood, because I was still implementing the protocols, still exposing her to chemicals, still manipulating her environment, still pushing her toward complete breakdown. The enhanced suffering directive didn't have an end date. It just said maximum psychological stress until subject death or complete incapacitation. She wasn't dead, so I kept going. James Peterson died in year 13, heart attack. Natural causes, the medical report said. Stress-induced cardiac event. He was 51 years old, too young, but 12 years in this vault aged people faster than time alone could explain. He'd been loyal until the end, dedicated. He died thinking he'd protected us from saboteurs, died thinking I was a good man, a good leader. He never knew the truth, that the saboteur was me, that every crisis he'd responded to, I'd caused, that Marcus Webb was innocent, that James himself was just another test, subject. I gave the eulogy at his funeral, talked about honor, service, sacrifice. Then I went home and added his death to the list. Marcus Webb was still in detention. 7 years now. 7 years in a cell for crimes he didn't commit. I'd visit him sometimes, bring him meals, check on his condition. He'd stopped protesting his innocence around year 3, stopped speaking at all around year 5, just sat in his cell, staring at the wall, existing. I'd broken him completely, stolen 7 years of his life, destroyed his reputation, his relationships, his sanity, for no reason except self-preservation, except keeping the experiment running. I'd sacrificed him, and he didn't even know why. Didn't know he'd been innocent all along. The children who'd been 5 when we entered the vault were 17 now. Young adults who'd spent their entire conscious lives underground, who didn't remember sunlight, who thought this was normal, who'd been shaped entirely by my experiments. I'd warped an entire generation, created trauma responses I could track, coping mechanisms I could document, behavioral patterns I could analyze. They were my magnum opus, perfect subjects raised from childhood, in controlled conditions. The data was comprehensive, detailed, utterly worthless, because no one would ever read it, no one would ever benefit from it. It was just cruelty documented extensively. Year 14 brought equipment failures I couldn't control, real ones, not experimental protocols, actual breakdowns from systems that had been running for 17 years without proper maintenance. The water purification system was failing. The air recyclers were operating at 60% efficiency. The reactor was showing stress fractures. The vault was dying around us, infrastructure collapsing, and I didn't know how to fix it. Because I'd been so focused on breaking people that I'd neglected keeping the actual life support functional. We had maybe 2 years before critical systems failed completely, maybe less. I called a meeting with the department heads, the ones who were still functional, explained the situation, the infrastructure crisis, the timeline, the fact that we needed to consider evacuation, opening the vault door, leaving. They looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Leave the vault? Go outside? Into the radioactive wasteland? That was suicide. That was death. I'd spent 17 years telling them the outside was uninhabitable, that the vault was the only safe place, that we had to stay sealed to survive. Now I was telling them we had to leave. They didn't believe me, thought I was having a breakdown, thought the stress had finally broken their overseer. Robert Chen was there, older now, grayer, quieter, but still functional. He asked the question no one else would. Why had I let the infrastructure degrade? Why hadn't I prioritized maintenance? Why had I focused on other things while the life support systems rotted? He was asking the right question, the one I couldn't answer honestly, because the truth was, I'd been too busy conducting experiments to care about keeping people alive, too busy documenting suffering to prevent actual disasters, too busy being Vault-Tec's servant to be an actual overseer. I told him it was complicated, that I'd made difficult choices, that hindsight was always clearer. He nodded, but he knew I was lying. He'd always known. I made the decision unilaterally. We would open the vault door, evacuate in organized groups, take what supplies we could carry, head for the surface, hope that 17 years had been enough time for radiation levels to decrease, hope that something survived up there, hope that we could rebuild. It was a desperate gamble, but staying was certain death. So we'd gamble. I announced it over the PA system, gave people 3 days to prepare, 3 days to pack their lives into bags and say goodbye to the only home most of them remembered. The panic was immediate. People demanding explanations, demanding alternatives, demanding I fix the infrastructure instead of abandoning the vault. But there was no fix. The parts we needed didn't exist. The expertise we needed was gone. The time we needed had already passed. We were trapped in a dying box, and the only way out was through the door we'd sealed 17 years ago. Some people accepted it, started packing, started preparing. Others refused, said they'd rather die in the vault than face the wasteland. I didn't force them, didn't argue, just noted their choices and moved on. My ex-wife couldn't leave her room. The agoraphobia was too severe. Medical said they'd have to sedate her for transport, carry her out unconscious. Otherwise, she'd die of panic before we reached the surface. I approved the sedation, added a note that she was a medical evacuation case, didn't mention that I'd caused the condition that made evacuation impossible for her, didn't mention that her psychological state was my creation, just classified her as a casualty of vault life. One more statistic. My daughter refused to speak to me during the 3 preparation days, packed her bag in silence, said goodbye to the few friends she had, wrote letters to people she'd never see again. She was 14 years old and preparing for exodus like a refugee, because that's what she was, what we all were, refugees from a failed experiment, from a vault that had become a tomb, from an overseer who'd betrayed every trust. She looked at me once during those 3 days, just once, and the look said everything: hatred, disappointment, disgust. She knew. Maybe not the details, but she knew enough. My son asked me if we'd die outside, if the radiation would kill us, if monsters would eat us. He was 10 years old and genuinely asking if we were walking into certain death. I told him I didn't know, that it might be dangerous, that we'd have to be careful, that I'd protect him. He looked at me with those ancient eyes, eyes that had seen too much in 10 years, and said he didn't believe me, said I'd never protected anyone, said everyone knew the overseer had failed. Then he walked away, left me standing in the corridor, alone. A 10-year-old child had seen through me completely, had articulated what everyone else was too polite to say. I'd failed, utterly, completely, in every way possible. The night before evacuation, I went to my terminal one last time, pulled up all the reports, 17 years of data, thousands of pages, millions of words, every experiment documented, every subject tracked, every atrocity recorded. I compiled it into a single file, encrypted it, left it on the mainframe with a note for whoever found it, for historians, for archaeologists, for anyone who wanted to understand what happened here. I titled it Confessions of Vault Overseer, a Study in Human Cruelty. Then I set the terminal to auto-transmit if anyone ever accessed the vault systems. My legacy, my testimony, my warning. I visited Marcus Webb in his cell that night, told him the truth, all of it, that he'd been innocent, that I'd framed him, that every year he'd spent in that cell was my fault, that I was sorry. He listened in silence. When I finished, he stood up, walked to the bars, looked at me, and said 3 words: "I forgive you." Then he smiled. Not a happy smile, a sad smile. The smile of someone who'd finally received confirmation of something they'd always suspected. He asked if he could leave the cell now. I opened it. He walked out, disappeared into the corridors. I never saw him again. I went to medical and sat with my ex-wife. She was already sedated for transport, unconscious, peaceful. I held her hand, told her everything, knowing she couldn't hear, confessed every protocol, every manipulation, every chemical exposure, every lie, told her I'd destroyed her deliberately, systematically, that her suffering had been my choice, that I was sorry, that I'd always love her, that I hoped she'd survive too, hate me properly. Then I kissed her forehead and left. Medical staff would carry her out in the morning. She'd wake up outside, free, damaged but free. The morning of evacuation arrived. We gathered in the atrium. 247 people, 65 had chosen to stay, chosen death in the vault over uncertainty outside. I didn't judge them. Maybe they were right. Maybe the wasteland would kill us all. Maybe staying was the braver choice. We'd never know. I gave a final speech, brief, simple, told them I was proud of their courage, that we'd survived together, that the worst was behind us, all lies, but comforting lies, the kind people needed to hear before walking into the unknown. Robert Chen was standing near the door. He caught my eye, walked over, handed me something, a coffee mug, old, chipped, the replacement for the one he'd broken years ago, the one that had triggered his breakdown. He said I should carry something from the old life into the new one, something to remember. I took it, thanked him. He nodded. Then he said something that made my blood stop. He said he'd figured it out. Not all of it, but enough. said he'd known for years that something was wrong, that the Overseer was connected somehow, that the patterns were too perfect to be random. He said he understood why I hadn't told anyone, why I'd kept the secret. He said he'd have done the same thing, protected his family, chosen the lesser evil. Then he walked away, left me standing there, holding a coffee mug, realizing I hadn't been as careful as I'd thought, that people had known, had suspected, had chosen to stay silent because the truth was worse than the lie. We opened the vault door at 10 hours. The sound was deafening. 17 years of seal breaking, metal screaming, hydraulics groaning, light flooding in, real light, sunlight, not the artificial lights we'd lived under. Actual sun. People covered their eyes, cried out. Some people cried. Some people laughed. Some people just stood there, paralyzed. It was too much, too real. After 17 years of controlled environment, the chaos of outside was overwhelming, but we moved forward, one step at a time, out of the vault, into the wasteland, into whatever remained. The surface was different than I'd expected. Not a dead world, changed, damaged, scarred, but not dead. There was vegetation, mutated but alive. There were structures, ruined but standing. There was life, strange life, dangerous life, but life. The world hadn't ended. It had transformed, adapted, survived without Vault-Tec, without protection, without overseers. It had survived anyway, and looking at it, at the broken, beautiful, terrible world, I realized something. We'd never needed the vault. The experiments had been pointless from the start. Humanity didn't need to be tested to prove it could survive. It just survived, messily, imperfectly, but it survived. Everything I'd done had been for nothing. We made camp that first night on a pralong hillside overlooking the vault entrance. People exhausted, scared, but also excited, free. For the first time in 17 years, they were free, not controlled, not monitored, not subjects, just people, under the stars, real stars, not projected on a vault ceiling, actual infinite space above them. My daughter sat away from the group, alone, looking at the sky. I walked over, sat down next to her. She didn't leave. We sat in silence for a long time. Then she said something I'll never forget. She said the sky was worth it. All the suffering, all the pain, worth it to see the sky. I didn't tell her the sky had always been there, that she could have seen it years ago if I just opened the door. I just nodded, let her have that moment. My son fell asleep against my shoulder that night. First time in years he'd voluntarily touched me. He was exhausted, overwhelmed, but safe. Safer than he'd been in the vault anyway. I held him, watched the stars, thought about everything I'd done, everything I'd become. I was a monster. That was clear. No redemption arc would change that. No good deed would balance the scales. I'd tortured hundreds of people for 17 years. Destroyed lives, broken families, killed the innocent, framed the guilty, betrayed every trust. And for what? For data no one would read, for experiments that meant nothing, for a corporation that didn't exist, for orders I could have refused, but I'd been afraid. That was the truth I'd never admitted. Not afraid of Vault-Tec killing me, afraid of making the wrong choice, afraid that refusing would result in something worse, afraid that someone crueler would take my place, afraid that my family would die if I didn't comply. Fear had driven every decision. Fear had turned me into a monster, and fear was a coward's justification. I could have chosen differently. At any point, I could have told the truth, could have refused, could have sabotaged the experiments, could have opened the door years ago. I had the power. I just never had the courage. The wasteland was harsh. We lost people in the first month. Radiation sickness, creature attacks, accidents, starvation. The weak died first. The elderly, the sick, the damaged. My ex-wife lasted 2 weeks. Her body had been too broken by the experiments, by the chemicals, by the psychological trauma. She died quietly one night. Never really woke up from the sedation. Never saw the sky. I buried her on a hillside with flowers growing nearby. Mutated flowers, but flowers nonetheless. Robert Chen gave a eulogy. Said she'd been brave, strong, resilient. I didn't correct him. Didn't mention I'd systematically destroyed her resilience. Let her be remembered as brave rather than broken. Marcus Webb found us 3 months into the wasteland. He'd left the vault through a maintenance tunnel, been surviving on his own. He was thinner, harder, but alive. He integrated into our group without drama. Never mentioned the 7 years, never accused me, publicly. Just existed, parallel to me, a living reminder of my sins. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me, not with hatred, with something worse. Pity. He pitied me. The man I'd imprisoned pitied his jailer. That's how far I'd fallen. We found other survivors eventually, communities that had rebuilt, towns, trading posts, the NCR in the west, the Brotherhood in the east. Civilization had survived, thrived, even. The vaults had been unnecessary. The experiments had meant nothing. Humanity had adapted without Vault-Tec's help, without controlled conditions, without scientific oversight. They'd just survived. Through cooperation, through adaptation, through the sheer stubborn refusal to die. And I'd spent 17 years torturing people to study survival, when all I needed to do was open a door and watch the world prove itself resilient. My daughter grew up in the wasteland, became a scavenger, good at finding supplies in ruins, good at staying alive. She never forgave me, never. Spoke to me unless necessary, but she survived, thrived, eventually, met someone, built a life. I watched from a distance, proud, heartbroken, grateful she'd survived despite me, guilty that I'd made survival so much harder than it needed to be. She had children eventually, my grandchildren, who grew up free, under the sky, building something new. They didn't know what I'd done. She never told them. That was mercy I didn't deserve. My son became a teacher, taught wasteland children how to read, how to think, how to hope. He was good at it, patient, kind, everything I hadn't been. He spoke to me sometimes, careful conversations, civil, but never close, never trusting. He'd learned young that trust was dangerous, that even fathers could betray you. I'd taught him that, permanently, irreversibly, but he'd taken that trauma and turned it into purpose, taught children so they wouldn't grow up afraid, so they'd have the safety he'd never had. I was proud of him, wished I could tell him, knew I'd lost the right. I'm an old man now, 53 years old, ancient by wasteland standards. I've outlived most of the original vault residents, outlived my wife, outlived the experiment, outlived my usefulness. I keep moving, settlement to settlement, never staying long, never forming attachments, just existing, waiting to die, carrying my guilt like cargo. I've tried to do good things, help people, make amends, but you can't amend torture, can't apologize for systematic destruction, can't balance the scales with good deeds after you've poisoned the well. I'm telling you this story because it needs to be told, because someone needs to know what happened in that vault, what really happened. Not the official version, not the Vault-Tec propaganda, not the survivor stories. The truth, from the monster's mouth. I was a good man who made terrible choices. Or maybe I was always a monster, waiting for permission. I don't know anymore. But I know this. If you're ever given power over people's lives, over their freedom, over their safety, think very carefully about what you're willing to do, what you're willing to become. Because it's easy to rationalize cruelty when you're afraid, when you're protecting something, when you're following orders. But rationalization doesn't make it right. It just makes it easier to live with, until it doesn't. Until you're an old man in the wasteland, carrying ghosts, waiting to join them. The vault still stands, empty, sealed again. A tomb full of data no one will read. A laboratory where hundreds of people suffered for no reason. A monument to the banality of evil. To what happens when good people choose fear over courage. When they prioritize safety over morality. When they become what they're afraid of. I go back sometimes. Stand at the entrance. Remember every name, every face, every betrayal, every choice. It's my penance, my hell, and I'll carry it until the wasteland finally claims me too. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have been braver? Would you have refused? Would you have found a way to save them? Or would you have made the same choices, told yourself the same lies, become the same monster? I hope you never find out. I hope you never have to choose between evil and greater evil, between complicity and chaos, between your family and your humanity. Because once you make that choice, once you cross that line, there's no going back. There's no redemption. There's only carrying the weight until it crushes you. And trust me, eventually it will.